Less than a month since the election of the Albanese government, and Australia finds itself in the midst of an energy crisis. Gas prices have soared on the east coast. Coal-fired power stations are closing down, and the renewables touted as their replacement are not ready to fill the void. Sky News host Matt Cunningham spoke to Director of Australian Public Affairs, Matthew Doman.
It's a crisis, a situation we're facing that's been a long time coming. Australia has managed the energy transition well in some moments and in some jurisdictions, and much less well in others. And in the eastern states particularly, we've seen a dependence on coal-fired power, which has served Eastern Australia very well for decades, but which is now being progressively phased out. And arguably is being shut down and neglected sooner than it ought be. So we have problems with the coal-fired power fleet in the eastern states. We have maintenance issues that seem to be coincidentally occurring simultaneously. Coal-fired power is out. Coal supply is interrupted. Global energy prices are escalated. And so we're finding pressure both on those coal-fired power generations, but the gas fleet that normally would play a role in bridging that gap is also struggling with high prices and limited availability. So meanwhile, renewables are just not ready, particularly in the eastern states, to take up the slack. So we have a very difficult situation in Eastern Australia, one that will take some time to resolve.
So obviously a problem in Eastern Australia, Matt, but are there parts of the country where this transition to renewables is being done well?
Well, South Australia stands out as a case in point. South Australia now, many days this year, has got 100% of its electricity from renewable energy. But 2 weeks ago, when a cold snap hit the country and the sun wasn't shining and the wind wasn't blowing, it was able to get 80% of its power from natural gas, about 19% from diesel and 1% from what was the world's largest battery built by Elon Musk north of Adelaide a couple of years ago. And South Australia's been much maligned in the energy debate. Of course, it's had its problems. In 2017, it had a major blackout when freak weather events took out the wind generation capacity, and gas wasn't able to take up the slack at that moment. And that plunged that state into an energy crisis that lasted for several days and saw all sorts of effects, from hospitals being without energy supplies, business closing down, etc. But since that time, and perhaps preceding it even, through its both its predominance of natural gas and its development of renewable energy sources, South Australia has for some time got about half of its power from gas and about half of its power from renewables. And that's a partnership that served South Australia well. You can turn gas on and off quickly. You can respond to fluctuations in wind velocity and the intensity of the sunshine. The eastern states, with their dependence on coal, the relative lack of investment in renewables, find themselves stuck, and it's going to take quite some time to unstick that energy market. What we've seen is pressure on, for environmental reasons, to close down and get off our dependence on coal-fired power. We're seeing companies take decisions amidst that public policy and public opinion pressure, but also their commercial objectives to move towards net zero, to be more sustainable energy providers, to bring forward the closure of power-fired fleets, and it would seem underinvest in their maintenance. So when these problems have occurred in recent weeks, we've seen a surge in electricity prices, we've seen a surge in gas prices, and it's put enormous pressure on the homes and businesses that rely on natural gas, not forgetting that there's about 200,000 jobs in New South Wales that rely on sustainable gas supply. So these issues need to be sorted through. They're a challenge for the new government. All indications are so far the government's taking a very balanced position. We've seen acknowledgements from the Prime Minister, from the Energy Minister Chris Bowen, from the Resources Minister Madeleine King, of the need to get a sensible outcome, that these problems can't be fixed overnight, that they do require in part the continued development of gas resources. They will require enormous investment in renewable energy, and all of these things need to be managed over time. We haven't done that well for over a decade. We need to do better at it going forward.
You talk about the availability of gas being an issue at the moment. I mean, obviously it's going to be a difficult issue to resolve in the short term, but long term, where is the potential for gas and the availability of that gas and getting that gas out of the ground, be it offshore or onshore, and trying to bring down some of these prices?
Well, this is one of the major issues. There are significant gas resources in Australia. Australia is already a very significant gas producer. We're currently the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. We're not the world's largest pipeline exporter of gas by pipeline. That role is held by Russia. And of course, that role is fundamentally under threat now, and the world is having difficulty adjusting to that new energy reality. So, but the good news for Australia is that we've got significant gas resources in the Northern Territory, in Western Australia, in New South Wales, both onshore and offshore, and still gas resources in Queensland and Victoria. But we've been reluctant to develop them for a whole range of reasons, and frankly with strong political, environmental activism against the continued development of fossil fuels, Australia has moved too slowly to bring new gas resources into the market. We've also moved not quickly enough to develop our renewable energy capacity. We mentioned South Australia as a case in point, but there are other areas where we just haven't brought sufficient investment into renewable energy. There's a lot of discussion around increasing our wind power generation, both onshore and potentially offshore. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen, of course, and the beginning of significant investments flowing into that space. But none of these things have kept pace with the evolution and actually the deterioration of our coal-fired power plants. So we've got a situation akin, I think, to the relationship between the fax machine and email. The fax machine didn't fall into disuse because governments had mandated email targets. We started to use email because it's better, it's more efficient, it's cheaper, and it uses less paper, and therefore it's environmentally more sustainable. But we moved to it because it was better. Ultimately, we'll move to renewable energy because it's better. Once we get over a very considerable investment mountain, it will be cheaper, it will be cleaner, and it will be sustainable and provide energy for long term. It needs to be supported whilst it's to counter its intermittency by either batteries or by typically gas to keep a supply of baseload power there. But Australia's got a lot of work to do, and that's something, of course, the government's turning its attention to. But right now, in places like the Beetaloo Basin in the Northern Territory and other places, we've got gas resources that can and should be developed, and I think that will be a focus of policy for years to come.